on the earth. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which faces Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the plain in the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Verse 4. The Lord then said to him, this is the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross into it. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the Lord's word. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, facing Beth Peor, and no one to this day knows where his grave is. Verse 6, isn't that interesting? To know that, now I've done a lot of funerals, as I said, a lot of funerals, but I've never done one that was a secret funeral. We have one here that was. We have a funeral here for which there weren't invitations and there weren't programs or anything. I've never done a funeral for a family of one, for just one person present. I've never heard of a funeral where they said, no one allowed. You can't come. Now, I have done funerals whereby it was only family allowed. I've done that. But not where nobody was allowed, that nobody came. Nobody was a part of it. It wasn't all that long ago that I did a funeral for a lady who said, I want no media coverage about my funeral. Now, when I say, obviously she hadn't passed away when she said that to me, because I had prearranged her funeral. But she said, put in my file, I want no obituary, I want no announcement, I want nothing said about my funeral to anybody. Thought that was a little strange, but that's what she wanted. So I certainly notated her file. She obviously had reasons for that. Maybe she owed a lot of money to somebody, I don't know. But nevertheless, she didn't want it announced that she had passed. Often funerals are judged. You know, when you go to a funeral, it's just kind of who we are. Funerals are judged by the number of attendees. You know, if I do a funeral and the place is packed, I think, now, this was a loved man, or this was a honored woman, and this was a person who was cared for and had done some good things, and so people are here to honor that person. Hardly would we think that one person in attendance would be very special. Now, I did do a number of funerals where there were just, sadly enough, just a handful of folks in attendance, and that kind of tugged at my heart a bit, thinking, that's kind of sad. You know, because you think that people would be grieving over your passing, and you affected their lives, and you were a part of their life enough that they would come and honor you in that way. But, you know, maybe I was thinking about it wrong. I don't know. But that's kind of what we do as humans. We kind of mark it in that way. And I guess I admit that when the place is full, when a chapel is full, I just would say that was a special person to a lot of folks. And I would say to them, I said, now, you know, if we had the time, for which we don't, but if we had the time for each of you to get up and say something about this person, how they affected you and what they meant to you, and maybe some anecdote, some funny story perhaps, or some journey along their way, we'd probably never leave this place because we'd be here a long time because you'd be telling those stories. But what a great funeral this must have been we just read about, where God was the only participant. present with Moses. Here we come to the end of the life of a man with great nobility. You best know that Moses was a great man and affected the lives of millions, of course. And so, but the death of Moses was kind of a revelation. And I want to point out some ways that I think that his death was a revelation that perhaps we might consider for our own life. One of the things that we find in that passage is that Moses' death was a revelation of God's tenderness, of the tenderness of God's heart. Can you see with me Moses as he climbed that mountain, as he was going and traveling according to God's plan? And notice him looking back over his shoulder, stopping to pause and see the place where he had just come from, and wondering what's the very point of this last pilgrimage that I'm making here, perhaps. And what was it for him? Well, it's because God, in his tenderness, wanted to show Moses one last time and make clear to Moses his promise. His promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And wanted him to be up and have a vantage point for which he could see. You know, I think perhaps God provides that for us all the time. Now, we don't climb a mountain to get a better vantage point. But we can look back over our lives, can't we? We're still breathing. We're still alive. And we're still pumping blood. So we have time to look over our life and realize the things that we've done, things that we haven't done, wishing perhaps things we hadn't, shouldn't done, grateful for the things that we did do that gave honor to God. We've all got those comparisons in our life. Wish I hadn't, glad I did. And we have that vantage point even now. So here Moses is going up on this mount to give this, for God to give him this vantage point. So Moses, way before I promised this, way before you, Moses, God's saying, I promised all this to Abraham. He's the one I made those first promises to. Speaking of God's tenderness, there's an old Jewish proverb I read, said this: God took away the soul of Moses with a kiss. God took away the soul of Moses with a kiss. Interestingly, friends and families and those he influenced were absent from the scene. They weren't there to talk about Moses and his life. This special loved friend of God had a special audience just with God. Wow, that had to have been a special time for the Father and for Moses. Can't imagine how that somehow points to the love focus God had for Moses, that he wanted to take care of all that all by himself. Moses' steps, his last steps, indicated a revelation of God's tenderness in his life. May God show the same kind of tenderness for your life and for my life as we come to the end of our journey. We don't know what that day will be, of course. We can't mark it. We can't have an influence on it, or choose not to for sure. But it was a revelation of God's tenderness. It was another revelation, and it was of God's carefulness. God's carefulness. In verse 6 says to us that no one to this day knows where this grave is, where Moses was buried. You know what would have happened, don't you, had they known where this grave was? They probably would have built a humongous shrine to Moses. If the Israelites were allowed to bury him, it might be another one to match the Tower of Babel, who knows, to enshrine this man. And would have been a great edifice for sure to the name of Moses. I don't know that why God would choose to why Satan would even try to alter God's plan. But in Jude, we find the passage in verse 9. Yet when Michael the archangel was disputing with the devil in an argument about Moses' body, can you imagine that kind of a dispute? He did not dare utter a slanderous condemnation against him, but said, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan." I love the translation of J.B. Phillips as a Bible translator. You may have a copy of Phillips' translation in your own personal library. It's a good translation. But in his translation, he puts it this way in that passage. But I would remind you that even the archangel Michael, when he was contending with the devil in the dispute over the body of Moses, did not dare to condemn him with mockery. He simply said, "The Lord rebuke you." Now, we don't have any clue as to why that battle went on, but we know that God trumped all of it with his plan. It was a revelation of God's carefulness to place his man, Moses, where he wanted him to be in his death. You see, God always knows what to do, and God always knows when to do it. When we think about persons of our own fellowship who have recently passed away, and we think, boy, I wish that hadn't happened at that point. I'd love to have spent more time with her, or I'd love to have spent more time with him and got to know them, and maybe God would have given them one more fresh breath of energy to be involved like they were at one point and one time. But God always knows what to do, and God always knows the right time when to do it. Even when it comes to protecting his own name, God knows that. It was a revelation of God's carefulness. It was a revelation of God's tenderness. But we know that God is a holy God, don't we? He is a holy God. He even says, "Be holy as I am holy." But it is a revelation of God's holiness, how he handled this whole issue of Moses passing. Well, you don't really know how Moses must have grieved over his sentence. You say, well, what sentence was that? Well, you know, Moses did not get to pass over into Canaan because he had killed the Egyptian. And it was a punishment that God had pronounced on Moses. That's why God wanted to take him up on this mount right there before he died. He said, "Moses, I want you to see how I'm going to keep my promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and show you all the land that your people will possess, because I'm a God of holiness." God couldn't deal with Moses as an ordinary man. Moses was a called individual. You know that how God used him in this whole situation of releasing his people from Egypt, from all their enslavement, and the great exodus of them leaving after he had approached Pharaoh time and time again, "Let my people go." Moses was a special man. He wasn't an ordinary man. He was a leader, and he was an example to the Israelites. And because of that, God felt in his wisdom that it was necessary to use Moses as an example of what happens when we're disobedient to God. Punishment often happens. We know it did for Moses. It has for you. It has for me. It has for others who've disobeyed God, haven't walked according to his plan in every part of your life. You say, well, now I don't remember God punishing me, because you may not know that he has. You see, part of the way that God punishes us is by not allowing the blessing that he had for us to come to us because of our disobedience. And you don't know what that blessing was because he didn't tell you. I'm not going to bless you with this. I'm going to leave that from you. But could well be that because of our disobedience, that God chose not to bless us in a certain way. How important it is for you and for us to walk rightly with God. Spend time in his word. Spend time speaking to him, blessing others' lives and serving others' lives, so that we might be right under the spout where the glory comes out and don't miss God's blessing that he has for us. This is why I think it's so important for us as a church here at Nolensville First Baptist Church to make sure that we're walking straight, walking right, walking pure, that our hearts are always keyed into what God wants for us, so we don't miss his blessing. I can assure you, if he doesn't use First Baptist, he'll go somewhere and use another body of believers who are walking right. That's what he'll do. His work will be done. I want him to do it through us. Amen? I want him to use this church, these individuals, who you are. Let me say that in the office today, I was looking through little boxes we have in some little cabinet. It's kind of interesting. You might want to spend some time in there sometime and look through those cabinets. You'd be surprised what's in there. But I came through looking through the history, Brother Parker, of the church, of folks that joined this church, folks that transferred letters, folks for whom we sent letters out somewhere that they went and so on. And I'm telling you, it's like name after name after name after name. I'm thinking, who in the world? Where are these people? What happened to them? What's the history here? It's like, a mystery. But I just have to think that there was a day and there was a time for which God blessed so much work that was done here, and so many folks were involved in his ministry here, that it was a wonderful, wonderful day. We're looking for that again. We're looking for that again. And we're holding on to it. God has it for us. We're going to grab onto it. It's going to be a great, great day. But it's a revelation of God's holiness. I'll bet often when told to obey, when people of Moses' descent, when they were told to obey, they would often look back at the wilderness journey. So, well, I better obey God because, after all, we did spend 40 years wandering out in the desert here. It's about time we might want to walk right, walk straight, be obedient in all that we do. We don't want another 40 years of disobedience and wandering. Yesterday, I had a meeting with one of the members of the Nashville Baptist Association. As we were talking and we were looking over the the statistics of the years of our church, of attendance numbers, baptisms, Sunday school attendance, and all that sort of thing. And I'd say, no, what about, there's a gap right here. And I'd give 2 or 3 years that there was no numbers at all. It's like someone didn't turn the report in or something, I don't know. He says, yeah, that's kind of a wilderness wandering, isn't it? I says, yeah, it kind of looks like it, a wilderness wandering. We don't want those gaps, do we? We want to make sure that every year goes on God's record and goes in the record of the National Association and the state that Nolensville First is vitally involved in ministry. And things are moving and shaking in the midst of our membership. I think probably if Moses had escaped judgment, if God hadn't pronounced what he needed to do for Moses and keep him from going to the Canaan, to the promised land, they'd probably all seen it as a license to sin. Well, I guess it doesn't matter. We can just kill each other and, rob each other and burn each other's house down, and there's no recompense, there's no consequence, and so it doesn't matter. So God wanted to make sure that his people knew that there is consequence to sin. And we saw it here in Moses' life. So God's punishment showed that God is holy. He is holy. And he demands obedience from his people. And we can't get by without obedience and walking obedience. It'll show up in ways you never thought it would. But a last point I want just to mention to you is that it was not just a revelation of God's tenderness and God's carefulness and his holiness, but this whole last departure of Moses' life was a revelation of God's thoughtfulness. Perhaps mothers telling bedtime stories to their children. Mama, tell me the story about Moses again. Tell me about where Moses walked with God and yet he disobeyed and he had to be punished and he couldn't see the land of Canaan and all of that sort of thing. Because always the story of Moses would kind of wind up with disappointment, wouldn't it? It would wind up with a disappointed note that Mama would have to say, but kids, he couldn't see the promised land. It's like, but all the good things he did, yeah, all the good things he did. And he was blessed with and for those good things he did. But because of his disobedience to God, God chose to discipline him in this fashion. Kids, Moses disobeyed God and he was punished. Now, you wouldn't want to perhaps say that too many times to kids to scare them, but they have to know. And we have to know. We are kids. We are his children. We have to know that there's disappointments when we sin, and there is discipline when we do so as well. And remember, discipline's not bad. The root word of discipline is disciple. And so what God does when he's disciplining his children, he's teaching us. He's growing us. He's strengthening us. He's discipling us. Could it be that Moses accomplished more with his death than he did with his life? Could it be that the example that we have here of Moses, of God following through with his discipline, taught us more about obedience than maybe we would have learned from Moses in his life? Perhaps he knew this. Perhaps he did. And Moses may have gone home to the Father with a smile on his face, saying, teach all your children, teach all my people that there's consequences. Surely he was buried in a quiet corner where flowers bow down and birds sing, and there's great joy and honoring and hovering over his grave. But the presence of God can alter the entire atmosphere of a funeral. And God was present here. The only one that was invited to this funeral was God, of course. But when we have those of our loved ones who pass away, and if you go to that funeral and you know that loved one is not a believer, never gave his or her heart to the Lord, you know that you can be the one who will be a presence of God in that place. They may not know that. Of course, they won't know that. They're lying in a casket, or perhaps some of the fashion of how they passed away were disposed. But for those people that are in that place, you can be the example in the presence of God that you need to be, just as God was here for Moses. You can remind them that God's revelation is healthy, purposeful, and for their good. So Moses was a great character in the Bible. You may not have known so much that God was his undertaker, that God's the one who buried him, that no one knows where he's buried. But I think his last steps was a heavenly departure because God took him. And it's important to know that God's presence pointed Moses out as a special person in God's kingdom. But also it reminded us that there is consequence, even now, to our sin. Well, I thank you for being here tonight. I appreciate you coming, and hopefully that was refreshing to you.